Cette conférence va maintenant être enregistrée.
Okay, cool. Okay. Okay, so first of all, thank you to everyone who's here, and welcome to this second session of introductory courses to cognitive science. So first of all, a little disclaimer, this course will be in English, as we've explained in the mail. This is because some of the speakers don't speak French, and so we aimed at some sort of coherence. So we'll stick to English for this course. Some courses will be in English. And of course, the courses that will be made by speakers who speak French could be in English or in French. It really depends on all of you. So as you know, this is a course which is part of the Cours-Ernest. So those are courses by students from PSL and the ENS on a variety of subjects. And here we are going to take care of cognitive science. So I also forgot to say that my name is Dougall. I'll be the organizer for this session for this semester. So if you have any question related to the course in general, you can shoot me an email, and I'll make sure to respond. So first of all, I'll start with some general info, some administrative info on the course, and then I'll let the other speakers speak about cognitive science in general. This will be a course that aims at giving a very broad overview of cognitive science, and then each of the speakers will also give an overview of the different fields of cognitive science. You'll see what those are in a minute. But so first of all, just some basic info. So all the courses will take place between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. Every Wednesday, except for the Wednesday, which will correspond to breaks. But I'll show you the planning in the next slide. So for now, the location will be fully online until further notice. So we hope that we'll be able sometime this semester to move on site, even though it's not really looking as if it's going to be the case anytime soon. But anyway, so if you're here, it means most probably that you have already signed up, but I put you the link here just in case it's not the case. Because if you're not signed up, then you won't be in the mailing list and you won't receive emails concerning the course. And if you want all this general info and the syllabus of the course, which I also sent in today's email, you can access it also by this URL. So the syllabus, the planning of the semester looks like this. So I won't delve into the details. You'll also have the slides on the Google Drive. So just watch out for the breaks. There'll be a break on the 24th of February and on the 21st and 28th of April. There's a little typo here. It's supposed to be 04. And if you want to have the summaries of those courses, you can go to the syllabus, which I told you about earlier. So a little bit more of the boring stuff. So the syllabus and the course slides, and also maybe more, such as articles or bibliography, will be on the Google Drive. So you can use this URL. I can also put it in the chat. I'm just going to check if I can do that right now. No, maybe not. Well, I'll do this later so you can have it. If you want to contact me or the speakers, you have the contact info in the syllabus. So if you want to ask questions on the course more generally, you can send an email to me. And if you want to ask questions on specific courses, you can send emails to the speakers who are responsible for each of those courses. And of course, don't hesitate to ask questions either after the courses, before the courses, or during the courses. Don't hesitate to activate your mic. it'll make everything more interactive, which is also the idea of the course. And so I think I've covered pretty much all the basic info. So now we can move to the more interesting stuff. So I'll make Iona presenter, because she's going now to tell you a little bit about the history of cognitive science and what it is. How can you define it? So I stopped sharing my slides. And okay, so now you should be able to share your slides, Iona.
Course 1, I guess. Is it okay? Okay. So first of all, we'll just define what are cognitive sciences and what they are about. So first, some general concepts about cognitive sciences. So they are multiple disciplines that have that comes from very different fields of research, such as as you can see here, computer science or linguistics or philosophy. This is a very large panel of disciplines, and the question is, how do we unify them by to make something coherent in cognitive science? And so there are all about three main ideas. So they have approximately the identical aim. So it is to study mind and the mind and its process as themselves a science. And then, so for example, psychology will study the mind, but with this idea that they have their own methods, their own ways to think and explain and understand the mind. And second, the main thing that allows us to speak about cognitive science as a unity is that they form all a network of disciplines, and this network is has to help the disciplines of cognitive sciences to communicate between themselves. And this is the issue of cognitive science, because this is the problem is we don't really know what is the link between philosophy and computer science, for example, and it's totally normal, because at first there is known, but cognitive science, as they have all the same objects, that is mind, they have to communicate together. And so for this, we have to found cognitive science as one main attitude, one main scientific ethos, that is naturalism. And it is very precise, and I will come back on this notion in my part on philosophy, but this idea that the program these disciplines have chosen is to naturalize the science of the mind. And it is a very different position from what we know about what have been made in this whole panel of science of mind. It is something that is very new, and no one has done it with this scientific with the scientific the tools of natural sciences. And so this is where the tools are the main actors of these sciences, as we have to use tools that are used in natural sciences, in the methodology of natural sciences, to understand something that is not that physical in our mind, that is the mind. So how could we observe the mind when the mind is defined as something mental? So what does cognition mean? Cognition is a very large word, but one of the most precise and the most relevant one to describe what we in cognitive science are trying to understand. This is somehow, not exactly, but somehow a synonym to soul, spirit, mind, consciousness, brain, neuron, body. Okay, this is very large, as it is very well, the definition of consciousness, the definition of brain, the definition of spirit, etc., are very precise and distinct from cognition. However, cognition is something that we can observe through, we pretend as cognitive scientists to observe through all this notion of consciousness, of body, of brain, and as the brain has this main role in understanding cognition, it is often cognition is often mixed in its definition with this other notion that that are typically either anatomical or philosophical, but not really precisely defined in the fields of all these disciplines in cognitive science. For example, computer science has no idea about what is consciousness, but because of this definition of cognitive sciences as a network between disciplines, it has to be constantly discussing with this notion, even if it's completely philosophical or psychological notion. And so how do we precisely define cognition? Because here it's very vague, very large, and it doesn't mean anything. So what it means is how those cognitive scientists see, imagine, conceptualize, and modelize in cognition. So it is founded on this idea of information theory, that is mainly the idea of mind, cognition, as the something that is processing information. You can, for example, build an analogy on how a brain, or how a brain process information from outside, and how a computer process information that you are giving him. So this analogy is not perfect, but it is, first of all, a good way to see things. And I will just show you a schema about this. And well, it is just as if the mind was were a box in which a box where you can't see, in which you can't see anything. Well, and in this box you have inputs and outputs. Inputs. Well, the question is, well, why is the output different from the inputs? There has to be something in the mind that change the input in order to make an output. So it's this idea of reaction, or more like transformation. So it's like the mind is not creating information, but it is responding to information, just like the computer would respond to the things you're giving him and the question you're asking him to do, to answer. And so the question of cognitive science, all the goal of cognitive science is to open this box of mind and to see what is in it, what does, what changed, what modified the input like this, so that the output is well, it could be predictable or not, could be so complex that we can't understand it, etc. So this is the aim of cognitive science. So I will very briefly show you history of cognitive science. First of all, cognitive science emerged from a critic of behaviorism. Behaviorism doesn't want to open the box of the mind. Behaviorism say, okay, I can analyze and I can modelize and understand only what I see. It means what is the input and what is the output. So then with this with this criticism that emerged in 1940, 1950, cybernetics and cognitive sciences developed, and well, it is very linked because cybernetics is the main transdisciplines that are about information. And in 1943, from 1943 to 1960 or something like that, there were a lot of concerns about how to understand the mind and how to open this box. And so from there, a very large enthusiasm appeared for cognitive sciences as they were founded, until the neuroscientific turn, where the tools of neurosciences helped the scientists to question, to change their models of mind, thanks to the knowledge of the brain. That is the most important organ in this question about cognition. And then very lately, I don't know if we say that, whatever. In last years, there have been very a strong enthusiasm for the question of emotion, how we speak about emotion when we are speaking always about facts and reflection and intellect, etc. And so this will be the end of my presentation. There is 3 different approaches of cognition that are quite equivalent to this massive conference, neuroscientific turn and emotional turn. So this is known as cognitivism, which is this idea that the brain is a hardware of the mind, so that the brain is like a computer, is working like a computer, but the neuroscientific term help us to understand how it is limited. There are things that we don't understand, like the computer in the brain. Then there were a little before the cognitivism, the neuroscientist term, the connectionism that is quite the same as cognitivism, but it's just this idea of interaction, of networks, etc. And at the end, we have the embodiment enactment. That's is very recent and is this idea that we should maybe consider cognition not only from a neurocentric perspective, but also from a social and first of all, this idea that the body is essential, the emotions are essential, and that of course maybe we could think about cognition as in an environment, a social world, and an ecological world. That will be it. So, how do we change the document?
You have to right-click on the on my name, and there's a I think left click. Yeah.
Ok. Alors. Je me suis pas trop posé la question. J'avais pas.
Attends, je crois que je peux faire.
C'est bon. Ok. Cool.
Voilà. Okay. So now that you've heard all this and heard about what cognitive science is and what its history has been, you might still wonder why should we care about all of this? And although the questions and the object studies are very interesting per se, I just want for the next couple of minutes to drive the point home that cognitive science approaches really high stakes questions, and that it also has very real and concrete applications in everyday life. So first of all, we should care about cognitive science just because it approaches very high stakes problems and questions that we could qualify as sexy, as very interesting. Questions about the language, how does the brain learn and treat and generate language, for example? How can we explain social behavior? Can we control machines with our minds? How do humans distinguish right from wrong? And of course, this is just a small subset of the questions that can be approached by cognitive science and all its disciplines. And the good thing is that in the courses, the next courses that we'll have in this semester, we'll try to answer actually all of those questions I've put, just to give you an idea of what the content of the next sessions will be. So as I said, cognitive science can also be applied to everyday life in many aspects of the real world. It can be applied to health, to treat, for example, some diseases, or to assist some patients that have some conditions. Here I've put you an example of a team in Grenoble that has developed an exoskeleton that can be controlled by tetraplegic patients. And so this is a nice example of how cognitive science can help. So for example, patients that are paralyzed to move. Here, this is an example of what we call brain-computer interfaces. We'll have a course on that this semester. And very briefly, this is an illustration of connecting brains to machines to, in this case, improve the health of individuals. It can also be applied to education. So either in France, a very good example is the UK, where there have been a lot of interventions and of work on this evidence-based education, on the applications of cognitive science to improve the education from primary school to high school. This is an example of a website which is called the Education Endowment Foundation, which is a UK-based foundation which is devoted to basically provide resources to teachers, to parents, to students on how cognitive science can be applied to education. For example, they have a teaching and learning toolkit where they list different interventions that you could do in a school, and that they for each of those interventions they will provide the estimated cost, the strength of the evidence from cognitive science that supports those interventions, and also the impact in terms of months, in terms of benefits that may have on the education of students. And so finally, just to give another example, cognitive science can be applied to informed policy making. In France, for example, we have a structure which is called the Direction interministérielle de la transformation publique, where they have a behavioral science team, which is actually supported by a behavioral insights team, which is based in London, and that uses evidence from cognitive science to try and inform policy making at the level of the government. And one of the projects, for example, of this behavioral team, this is starting to be a bit old. It's from 2018, but it's just to illustrate this point. One of the projects they had here was, for example, to reduce the impact of stereotypes and work against hiring discriminations. This was especially focused on handicapped people, and they were trying to use cognitive science and use evidence from cognitive science to try and both increase the percentage of hired handicapped people by corporations, because in France the law states that you have to hire 6% of handicapped people. It's more around 4% right now. And they were also working against the stereotypes that the discriminations that handicapped people were facing, either in work or in everyday life. So I hope this has convinced you that we all should care about cognitive science, and now we'll have a presentation of all the fields of cognitive science by each of the relevant speakers, so that you have a better idea of what all of this, how all of this is organized. So this is, I think the first speaker is Iona. Ok, c'est bon.
Okay. So, first of all, it will be about philosophy. So, the question is, what the heck is philosophy doing in cognitive sciences? Well, I don't really know, but for sure, we have to know what could we give to cognitive science, the other sciences of cognitive science, to make them better with philosophy. Who knows, maybe. So, first of all, there is two main way to do philosophy about cognitive science. First of all, there is a discipline, well, a branch of philosophy that is the philosophy of mind, of the mind, and well, more specifically today, nowadays, it is quite often associated with cognitive philosophy. So, philosophy working in cognitive sciences. And on the other side, we have the epistemology of cognitive sciences that is at the, well, border of philosophy as its academical, in its academical form, and philosophy in the case of, specifically, in the case of cognitive sciences. So, philosophy of the mind. And the question of this slide is, what is the difference? So, first of all, here you will see that they don't have the same discourse. On the side of philosophy of mind, we have discourses about ontology. So, what is? Ontology is this idea that you will explain what is. And the philosophy of the mind consists of building an ontology in the frame of cognitive sciences, so that we can well, go further in cognitive sciences thanks to philosophically defined entities, objects, subjects, and concepts, of course. And maybe it will help the scientist, who knows. Second, there is this discourse about aesthetics, which is about perception. Aesthetics is the discourse about perception. So it can be a part of ontology as, well, what is what is sensed by you. So it's very linked, especially for philosopher in philosophy of the mind. And well, more precisely in phenomenology. And at the end, you can say that it is a way to build a nosology, so discourse about what we know, how we know, what is to know, what is knowledge, etc. And this is not meta. This is not about cognitive sciences. It is in cognitive sciences. So the philosophy of the mind is a discipline that will build the concepts, the definitions that are linked in a way or another with the scientific reflection of cognitive scientists. On the other side, epistemology of cognitive sciences is a meta-discourse. So it is speaking about cognitive science. It doesn't tell what we should think is in cognitive sciences. It's explain how those cognitive sciences analyze, explain, understand the mind. So what are their processes? So what are their methodology? And what are their objects? What the cognitive sciences are speaking about? So this is exactly what I was doing at the beginning of this presentation. It is about mind, but what mind? How do they know that mind? How do they observe it? How do they approach it through a naturalistic science? Well, all these questions are very fundamental in the epistemology of cognitive science. And at the end, it is about cosmology. And cosmology is a little bit like ontology, as it is speaking about the discourse that cognitive sciences have on their own objects. So cosmology is the discourse about the discourse of cognitive scientists. It is very meta. However, it's not that complex, not that conceptual. It's very simple, but we just have to understand that. And both have the same way to do things because both are from coming from the same place, so philosophy and academical philosophy. So they are both conceptualizing. They are both trying to integrate the concept in historical concept to their understanding of the mind, how it is understood nowadays, And so both have this question of history, both have this question of what is right, what is how to say it? What is a good concept in philosophy that we can use in cognitive sciences? And this kind of question, but it is slightly different in the way that for the philosophy of mind, we have a tendency to question the language theories. So when you have problems that emerge from cognitive sciences theories and how to resolve them or dissolve them with philosophy, and especially analytical philosophy, but not only, of course. And on the epistemology side, you have this tendency to analyze what scientific are doing in real life, like how they act, how they speak about their subject. This is globally the two main ways to speak in cognitive sciences when you're a philosopher. But the question is, well, okay, but what do you think? What do you produce as knowledge? Because we are cognitive sciences. So are philosophers building knowledge with concepts, or are they just talking about? Well, I hope they are building concepts and ideas that are helping scientists. However, we should really focus on this concept of consciousness, because this is the main idea that comes with this idea of mind. Both are different but very similar and always working together. So consciousness is defined very, very largely as a mental state, as something that lives and happen to know that it lives. Okay, so very largely this is consciousness. We have a distinction in the definition of consciousness in English that is a phenomenal consciousness versus an access consciousness. The phenomenal consciousness is what happened to you as an organism. What happened to an organism, whatever it is, an organism that is conscious. So, for example, the emotion, the perception, like, I don't know, I am cold. It is a phenomenal experience that then I can access with access consciousness through my own perception, my perception of myself. And the fact is that both are continuously working together. But, well, this distinction is somehow the distinction you will draw between something that you know versus something that, well, know or can know, versus something that you aren't necessarily able to know. But you can know it, but it's not necessarily something that you are conscious of. Then you have some example, like inner life is introspection, what I live, what I feel extra, my emotions, etc. The consciousness of is a mix of very different consciousness, like the consciousness of yourself, the consciousness of the world, the consciousness of yourself being conscious, etc. So yes, with mental states like awareness, how do you say it? Altered states of consciousness, this kind of things. This all is a part of consciousness. And from this concept, we are developing some other concepts like intentionality, emotion, perception, representation. All of this, I will speak about it later in my next presentation. And beside this concept, we have this secondary point that is very important, and this is linked to consciousness because it is called the hard problem of consciousness. This is the old mind-body problem, all because it exists since Descartes, because he was, well, speculating on something that is cognitive and something that is material. So something that is mental versus material. And the question is, how do they connect? And he was thinking about, the very well-known gland pineal, pineal glands. I guess. And well, it is not satisfactory, but this problem is still here, and Descartes didn't give a satisfactory answer, but we can't either. For example, we have in philosophy or cognitive science, very different approach, very different ways, very different theories that answer this problem. And there is absolutely no consensus, like zero. No one agrees with anyone. So you have this idea that, well, everything is mind, everything is mental. What is something that is mental. This is idealism. And you have this idea that everything is materialism, matter. So there are materialists. And nowadays, people are majorly materialists. But, it is not something that everybody agree with because we can't verify it. It's not like scientific theories or models. And then you have this idea that we don't have to ask about what is the mind, what is the consciousness, but this is eliminativism, and I don't like it, but it's quite relevant because, well, who knows, if we ignore ideas and everything that is mental, maybe we have some more rigorous way to proceed in science. I don't know. I'm not quite a fan of this, but okay, it's possible. And then you have this opposition between reductionism that say everything that is only matter or idea, but can't be both of them. And non-reductionism that say both exist and both are from the same essence, from the same substance or whatever. Well, there is a lot of ways to resolve this problem, and the main solution nowadays is to say, okay, we should break definitively this dualism of mind versus body, because maybe both of them are the same. And at the end, so I was asking you at the beginning, why would we do philosophy in cognitive science? First, it's practical, as we can define very precisely concepts about that we are talking about as scientists, like the mind, like consciousness, I don't know, and also a regulatory function, because, well, you have this idea that philosophy can guide your research when you're a scientist. You can, thanks to this, this conceptualization, this construction of ontology, of cosmology, you can guide your researcher through whatever seems you the best, and the best is defined by this ethical frame. So this idea that maybe my values as a being matter in my reflection. And the question at the end, this is the last question. This is very problematic because philosophy is absolutely not a natural science as it is founded. But, alors, il y a pas mal de questions. Okay. It is absolutely not a natural science. So how does philosophy works in a naturalistic research program, as I said at the beginning of this course. So the question of naturalism, I will speak about it next week, so it will be resolved at that time. But this idea is what is main is that maybe we should learn about scientific rigorness, something like this, in our work as philosopher. And this is a big problem, but well, maybe we will try to resolve it next week. As I said, this is the only course of philosophy, but it will be very enough. Okay, who is next? Magdalena? Where's she? Yeah.
Okay. Can you make me the presenter?
Yeah, I'll do it.
I made you, I think.
No.
No, I think you didn't. I'll just make you. Okay, should be good.
Okay, guys. So, can you see it? Can you see my red pointer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. So, hi everyone. My name is Magdalena. I am my second year PhD student in the 5-year PhD program at the DEC. And I'll give 2 courses, one on cognitive psychology and one on neuropsychology together with Patricia. Today I'll only briefly introduce what cognitive psychology is and what kind of questions cognitive psychology aims to answer, and what kind of questions that's even posed in the first place. So as you had seen, cognitive science as a whole had gone through quite a journey, and although it's not completely true that the first ideas about the mind had started in the 60s, it was a time when we specifically started asking questions in a more systematic way. So, as you've heard, cognitive science was in some way an answer or an opposition to behaviorism. You've heard a little bit about information theory. So that theory that the mind works as this processing unit between input and output. Behaviorism didn't care about the box that processed the input and output, and operated on the simple input and output associations. It sort of rejected the idea that the mind can be studied. Cognitive psychology came in with the opposition, with the idea that the box can be studied and the box should be studied. Cognitive psychology came with the questions such as, what is in that box? How is that box built? Why is that box even in the place? What is happening in the box between the input and output? And that was the main idea. That opposition was the main driving force of why cognitive psychology came in place after the cognitive revolution. So all of that knowledge we had about the mind before was a founding block for everything that cognitive psychology came in place. The ideas that stemmed from there came in place with the idea that we should go beyond the simple stimuli-response associations, and that human behavior is much more than these associations. That our internal life and the way that our responses come to life actually matters and is very complex and is fundamental to understanding our behavior and understanding the mind. one of the main points that cognitive psychologists brought in was that psychology should be a science. Because before, psychology was not science in the most strict definition of a science, such that it didn't create testable hypotheses, it didn't use control methods, and the complex theories that were created were more individual ideas made on individual observations. Cognitive psychology came in saying that we should create methods that are in line with the scientific method, and that our ideas about the behavior should be made based on this on testing hypotheses. These hypotheses should and can be tested on multiple levels of description and analysis. And the main driving force behind this methods that we created was the analogy between the mind and the computer. So by using this analogy, we started thinking of the mind as a processing unit between the input and the output. This analogy allowed us to systematically create the map of how different stimuli gives rise to multiple different behaviors. And within the field of cognitive psychology, multiple concepts have been created. And I'm sure most of you have some ideas about these concepts, and most of you ask yourselves questions about these concepts, such as language. How is it that we have multiple languages around the world? How is it that humans have that humans have that language? How is it different for other communication methods? Do other animals have communication methods that are similar to language? Memory. How is it that I can't remember what I ate yesterday for dinner, but I can exactly remember the taste of apple pie that my grandmother made me for my 5th birthday? How is it that some people are more intelligent than others? How is it that humans are capable of creating tools, and how is it that some animals cannot create tools? And how is it that we even see? What is that perceptual quality that I feel when I see a pretty dress? And I will illustrate on an example of perception how cognitive psychology can aim to answer these questions. So you can see, if you look at that simile on the right, I bet most of you feel like it was moving. I promise you that it's a static picture. It has no temporal structure, and that temporal structure in principle should be the requirement for the moving experience. This is an example of optical illusion, and such optical illusion can be studied in cognitive psychology in sort of 3 levels. We can start with the psychological level, when we defined what is the typical response to such such visual illusion. What are the individual differences between people on how they see, how they perceive that illusion, and what are the cognitive processes that go behind this illusion? We can then turn into biology and ask, what are the brain structures that are responsible for creating this illusion? What are the differences in biology in the structure of the brain that decide that some people have that illusion and some other people don't have that illusion? Are there any genetical predispositions for perceiving these illusions? And finally, on sociological level, we can ask ourselves, are there any differences between different cultures in perceiving this illusion? Are there differences? Is the environment in which you grow up, does it matter for people to perceive or not this illusion? And this is the kind of questions we're going to ask ourselves during the course of cognitive psychology. We're going to try to develop certain ideas about human behavior, certain cognitive biases, stereotypes, certain diseases that we observe in population, and how all of these give us some idea about what the mind, human and non-human mind, is. And finally, we will arrive to a point where that mind-computer analogy will not be enough anymore to create complex answers to complex questions that we now have, and now can pose, and now have methods to answer to. And as a sort of thinking exercise, I'll introduce you to what's called a thought experiment. Imagine, and this thought experiment is called the Chinese room, that was initially introduced by philosopher John Searle. And imagine you were in, there is a room in which there is a man who speaks originally English. He introduces input as in form of Chinese. And he has a complete rule book of translating this Chinese input of whatever it is into English. And then on the output, he sends English. Or the other way around. And then when he sends English, people outside will think this person speaks perfect Chinese and English. They can perfectly translate Chinese to English. However, that person in here has no actual quality of knowing what Chinese is. All they do is, by simple associations and simple rules between the Chinese alphabet and the English language, and that's how they do the translation. So this was the original idea about the behind rejecting the strong what's called the strong and weak artificial intelligence as an analogy of how the mind works. And so we're going to go deeper into it during the class. And I hope I intrigued you a little bit. We're going to see more illusions. We're going to see more about biases and how the brain generates them, and how what kind of cultural differences there are, and maybe how we can explain them in the future. Okay.
All right. Okay, sorry guys, I just need to authorize GoToMeeting to access to some just a sec. All right. All right, can you hear me? All right. Louis, maybe you want to share with me again the making me able to share my screen again.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I didn't see that there were two of you.
Yeah, yeah, I don't really get what happened actually. So I had to restart my app. So anyways.
Okay.
Okay, great. So can you see? All right. All right, you should be able to see my screen now, right?
Yep.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so I'm gonna talk to you guys about linguistics. Linguistics is a pretty major part of cognitive science, and we're gonna see why right now. Just to give you a little background, I'm a M2 student at the Cogmaster, and so yeah, I'm majoring in linguistics. So linguistics basically is the scientific study of language, and you might ask why we need to dedicate a whole field of study to a single object, contrary to philosophy or psychology that have many objects of study. So first kind of easy answer might be might be found in the structuration of the field of linguistics, which is pretty old and prior to the structuration of cognitive science as a research field. So it's really in the 19th century that linguistics became an independent field of study, especially drifting apart from rhetoric. But you can find accounts of like grammar treatises and analytics of the phonology and the prosody of language as far as the 8th century before Christ. Here you have a little example of one on the left of your screen. A major turning point in linguistics is in 1916 with the Cours de linguistique générale by Ferdinand de Saussure. This is the birth of structuralism. This was influential not really for the conclusion of Ferdinand de Saussure, but more for his approach of language as a system. He really introduced the idea that you could study language as a formal unified system, and especially he made the distinction that you might know between the signifier and the signified, which introduced a distance between the sign and the meaning of the sign, which was very influential and major for linguistics. Over the course of the 20th century, linguistics saw the integration of language to psychological theories. So Magdalena has spoken about behaviorism earlier. And for instance, for Skinner, who was big into behaviorism, language was explained, was completely integrable into this psychology theory. And the acquisition of language could be explained by the reward that infants and young children get by communicating properly. For instance, you utter random sentences over the first years of your life, and when you utter right sentences, you're happy to be understood, and so to obtain what you want to communicate to your parents or other adults, and this acts as a reward, which then reinforces your language activity. But these various integration of language to psychological theories, and especially to behaviorism, were kind of stopped by the arrival of Chomsky on the scene in 1959. Chomsky completely debunked the behaviorist approach of language that was developed by Skinner. He actually said that infants, by how they learn language, how they show early signs of language acquisition, could definitely not acquire language through a behaviorist approach, and they displayed some hard-coded capacity, faculty of language. And this was, you don't really need to remember this for now, but what you might want to remember is that this instaured like what we call the cognitive turn, and introduce the idea of mentalism in psychology, which is the idea that some faculties can come, and some knowledge can come directly from the mind and is not learned from experience, versus empiricism. And this was very influential. And so the fact that Chomsky introduced this revolution through the study of language and made language really the core of a complete theory of the mind might be also an explanation of why the study of language and linguistics is so important in cognitive science. But more substantially, we can also say that language is a very complex and singular object, and so therefore it should require a singular field of research. If you look at the sentence here, which is the first sentence of The Lord of the Rings, when Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 71st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. This is a pretty, I don't know, a pretty complex sentence with a lot of signs, a lot of imbricated structures, but it's definitely, all of you understood it online without any explicit processes or any specific operation. which is very different from the arithmetic operation that you can see at the bottom of the page. That you have to that you cannot perform online as fast as you process the sentence above. You need to actually implement an explicit algorithm in your mind to resolve the operation. You're probably gonna do you're gonna do the sum first and then do the multiplication. You have some tricks to do the multiplication. If you want to do it by hand, it's pretty hard. So we might ask ourselves why language is implemented so efficiently without any explicit algorithm in the mind, whereas a lot of other cognitive processes. And this is really what makes language and linguistics singular. So the first thing that we can say to explain this is having a closer look at what happens when you process language and when you process the sentence of the Lord of the Rings that I just presented. So actually, your process of the sentence involves a process on a variety of levels, which are represented by these concentric circles here. Each sub-level of language consists in an entire subsystem with rules, with properties. So the first subsystem is phonetics in green, which is the study of speech sounds. This is really the study of the physical stimuli. So their perception and also their production with articulation of the mouth and how you can produce different sounds with different placement of your tongue, of your lips, etc., etc. Another level, a higher level, a little more abstract, is the study of phonology. The study of phonology is the study of phonemes, so it's the categories of speech sounds that you hear when you hear language. And here we're facing a first intriguing result, which is that as language speakers, we have a categorical perception of sounds. And so people from different languages, from different culture with different maternal languages, will have a different perception of a same physical stimulus. For instance, here on the right, you can see the results from an experiment that was conducted by people from the DEC at ENS, where you present, so the stimuli is a continuous stimuli that you can see at the bottom of the page. So it's a sound that varies from ebzo to ebuzo, where the vowel u is inexistent at first and then made more and more and more present. And what you can see is that Japanese speakers, the dashed line at the top, they always perceive a u, even though when it's not present, that's the data point circled in red. Why do they have this illusion of presence of u, whereas French speakers, as you can see, they pretty well discriminate when the u vowel is present or not present, with a great detection of the u when when the vowel is very long. This illusion might be caused by the fact that in Japanese you don't have sequences of two consonants back to back. You only have a consonant followed by a vowel, followed by maybe another vowel or maybe another consonant, but a consonant is never followed by another consonant. And so this shows that in the early years of your life, your brain is parameterized and selects relevant categories to process the language that you're faced with, that you are experimenting in your household. So this is a first hint to the fact that language is processed in a very specific way in the brain. The other subsystem of language involve morphology, which is the study of the composition of words, syntax, the composition of phrases and sentences, and especially how grammar interacts within the sentences. Semantics is the study of meaning, a lot of logicians are involved in the study of semantics because it's a study of the truth value of sentences. And pragmatics, finally, is the most higher level of linguistics, of subsystems of linguistics, and is the study of meaning in contexts. So there is a notion of the intents of the speakers in pragmatics. So this very complex and singular object is even more singular because it is human specific. The ability the faculty of language is only present in humans, and it's determined by our genome, which then will influence the structure of our brain, but also the organization of our body, so for instance our vocal cords track, for instance the organization of our mouth, of the motor control of our tongue, of our lips, that makes it easy to have such a fine-grained control of those motor subsystems and make us able to speak. Because language is human-specific, it might be a reason why it has, from the very beginning, interested people in AI and in computational modeling. You might have heard of the Turing test that was established in 1950 by Alan Turing, the father of AI. The idea of this test is that we will be able to say that a computer has artificial intelligence when it will be able to fool a human, so it's the little human in C, to fool him, making him believe that he is a human. So when a computer will be able to interact with a human without this human realizing he's speaking to a computer and not another human being, this will be when we achieve artificial intelligence. This is an example of how, from the very beginning of cognitive science and the very beginning of computational modeling, language has always been considered as a specific property relevant for assessing language and cognition. Language is very specific to human and is different from other types of systems of communication because it has specific properties. Here you can see an illustration of productivity, which is maybe the most outstanding property of language, which is the fact that from a limited set of signs and a limited set of rules, so signs are letters, for instance, or phonemes if you're talking about speech, and rules will be the rules of syntax, of morphology. You can create an infinite number of meanings, an infinite number of sentences. You can create sentences that have never been spoken before. You can create sentences that have never been seen before. All that without having seen something specific. So all that having only seen the stimuli of language that you get from people talking around you. So so this is one of the properties that makes language different from other type of communication, and especially animal communication that don't have this type of properties. Within cognitive science, linguistics is studied in two main fields and a third field that arrived later, that is computational linguistics. So the two main fields are theoretical linguistics, that aims at creating as making exhaustive or systemic understanding and systemic explanation of what language is. And that is very preoccupied by building the kind of hierarchies that you can see on the left, hierarchies of sentence to see how sentences are organized and stuff like this. And you also have applied linguistics that are involved in what mechanisms are actually driving the evolution of language, our acquisition of language, and our perception of language. So it's kind of a more embodied approach to linguistics, and this involves a whole lot of subfields, psycholinguistics, neurolinguistics, that is really the study of how language is implemented and perceived in the brain, linguistic anthropology, which is how language is evolving and varying through societies, and evolutionary linguistics, which is a very a dynamic field in on how languages emerge, how they merge, how they evolve through time, through evolution. And of course, because this is cognitive science and there is a lot of interdisciplinarity, you have subfields at the intersection of those big fields. For instance, at the intersection of applied linguistics and computational linguistics, which is so a computational approach to linguistics, and especially modeling with computers and algorithm, language acquisition and language structures. You have some very interesting fields, such as evolutionary robotic application of language. So here on the right, you can see a little picture from the lab of Luc Stills, who implements evolutionary language games. So he's basically trying to figure out and to reproduce the emergence of a language by simulating it with robots. Here you can see robots who are kind of arguing and making emerge names of colors, which is pretty fascinating. And on the left, you can see at the intersection of theoretical linguistics and computational linguistics, the study of formal languages and automata theories, which is kind of a mathematical approach of what language is and how language can be modeled. This is which is also a very fascinating field. So how we can mathematically represent what a language is. All these subfields have their specific methods. So the theoretical linguistics is really involved with acceptability judgments and introspective data. This is kind of the only science in which you will have that you will see rely on introspective data. Introspective data are basically just asking people what do they think of sentences. So here you can see that Mary loves Peter is a pretty acceptable sentence. On the contrary, Mary Peter loves will be straightforwardly categorized as not acceptable, as illegal. This is what the little star means here, that it is an illegal sentence. And so the notion of acceptability here is not really to be linked with grammatical rule. We're not worried about the good usage of subjunctive or complex tense verb agreements, for instance, but just what speakers spontaneously consider right or wrong or acceptable or not. And this informs linguists on the structure of language and the structure of the system of language. In applied linguistics, you have a lot of different methodologies. You have behavioral measures, for instance, oculometry, which is a measure of the direction of the eye gaze to measure a reaction, for instance, of babies to a certain stimuli. You have the study of reaction times, and you also have the classical tools of neurology, so the study of patients with brain lesions and brain imagery, of course. In computational linguistics, you have the use of text mining, which is really searching through a huge amount of data to extract patterns of information, and machine learning, which is the implementation of statistical learning to model language acquisition and language perception. So the big questions driving the field can be divided in 4 big main domains. So some questions are related to getting a more exhaustive representation of language. complete our representation of language, and will be things like what system, so qualifying the system of a language. So what is the system that you are requiring? And this is really not a completely resolved question yet. You have a lot of questions about language acquisition and language usage, and finally question of universalism. So what do human languages have in common? How does we bridge the gap between the unicity of the human genome and the diversity of the languages? And then finally emergence, questions about the emergence of language. So you see that language as a specific, complex, human-specific object is a key element that provides a window to the mind, and that's why it has such a big and peculiar place in cognitive science. And so, if you're interested in linguistics, so we'll be talking about it in 2 courses mainly. So we'll be talking about neurolinguistics, and we'll be also talking about models of speech and language acquisition in the cognitive modeling course. All right, that's it for me.
Can you make me host, please? So, hi guys, my name is Panagiota, and I'm gonna present you cognitive neuroscience. Just let me find my presentation. Okay, here we go. And I'm gonna go fast because we are running late. But please interrupt me. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you see my cursor too?
Yeah, you can point.
Okay, perfect. So, what is cognitive neuroscience? And to put it as simply as possible, from all the stuff you are gonna hear or have heard today, it's the biology part. The goal of the neuroscientist is to figure out how these billions of cells in the human brain allows us to do whatever we do, walk, talk, be here, give this presentation, be absolutely excited or already asleep. And to do so, we just borrow knowledge and tools and language from many different fields, especially biology and subfields of biology like physiology, anatomy, molecular biology, even pharmacology. And we just want to see how this organ allows us to be and do what we do. And there are the building blocks of the brain, 2 main cells, the glial cells and the neuron cells. The glial cells are quite important. They provide functions like structural support and modulation. But what we actually gonna care about during this lecture and during this series of lectures are neurons, which are the basic signaling units in the brain, the ones that carry information and signals. And let me just start by saying that there are many kinds of neurons, as you can see here, and their variation is related to the function each neuron has. But the very basic neuron you are gonna see everywhere, it's this one right here, which is composed of 4 different compartments. We first have the soma, which is the main cell, comes from the Greek word for body, and which has the cellular machinery which allows the neuron to remain alive. And then we have 2 other compartments, the dendrites and the axon, which are actually extensions of the soma. The dendrites are considered are considered the input to the neuron, and the axon, on the other hand, is the output of the neuron. And what basically happens here is that there are electrical signals going on from the dendrites down, from inputs to the dendrites and going down the axon to the last compartment right here, the axon terminus. And how are these signals possible? It really depends on a property of the cytoplasm and the membrane of the cell, which actually allows the inside of the cell to be slightly negative in relation to the outside of the cell. For example, if we had a machine measuring the voltage just outside the cell, it would show theoretically 0. And if we carefully inserted the machine, which we call electrode, and we are going to see it in a future lecture, inside the neuron, we would see something like between -55 to -75 microvolts. And basically what happens is that presynaptic neurons, the ones that give information to the next neuron, excite or inhibit a bit the dendrites of the neuron. We say excitatory if it makes the inside of the neuron slightly less negative, and we say inhibit when it makes the inside of the neuron slightly more negative. And right here we have another little part which adds up all those signals from the dendrites and decides whether there's going to be an action potential traveling down the axon of the cell. And a really important thing to remember about the cells is that they are actually all or nothing. If there's enough excitatory signal that we reach a threshold, there is a spike or an action potential, which looks like this. It's a rapid depolarization and repolarization. And if we don't manage to reach the threshold, there's nothing. Quite dramatic, we can say. And another important thing to mention is that the intensity of the stimulus or the input signal, we can see it through the frequency of the spikes, not how high they are. So if something is a bit intense, we are going to see fast spikes. And right now, we have seen an action potential traveling down the axon, and it reaches the axon terminus, and it's now time to communicate with the next neuron. And there are two types of communication or synapses. There is first the chemical synapse, which is much more common than the electrical synapse. And what basically happens is once the action potential reaches the terminal, there are some chemicals released in the space between the two neurons. This is, by the way, the terminal of the presynaptic neuron, the neuron that gives information, and this is the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. The postsynaptic neurons bind those chemicals and get slightly more negative or slightly less negative. And then we have the other type of synapse, the electrical synapse, which is actually much more simple, but it's less common. And you can think of it as like having a kind of pipe between the neurons. And we can think of them as like being continuous, like the action potential continues through the second neuron. And to sum up, we just seen what a neuron is, how is it able to communicate with one another, and how it is able to produce an action potential. And let me just now zoom a bit on the outside and just tell you that there are many ways to study the brain, to divide it up into different parts. And you can do so according to the question you are trying to answer. One way is to study a system. Like, for example, we have a neuron, and then which then has connections with a few other neurons and forms a microcircuit. And then a few microcircuits form together a neural network. And then neural networks form what we call the neural system. For example, vision, you can think of it as like starting from the eye and going all the way back to the back of the brain, and then going to different parts of the brain according to how is it going to be processed. And then we go to this part right here, which actually shows other ways to break up the brain. And you can either break it based on its anatomy, like here, where we see the different parts of the brain and different parts of the cortex. The cortex is this part right here. Or you can divide it up according to functions, like a specific function is happening roughly in those areas with the different colors. Or you can divide up the brain based on the properties of the cells that make up the brain. And that was fast, I think. But in case you wanna look more into the brain, I highly suggest this book right here, which is actually what I just said, but like in a more complete way. And stay with us because we are gonna see more about this stuff in those lectures I marked right here. And that's it. That's your little introduction to neuroscience.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions right now, or should we take them all at the end? Okay, gonna assume that.
Yeah, at the end, I guess. Also, I think questions will probably be maybe more prevalent when we get to the actual parts.
Yeah, okay.
This is just an intro after all.
So should I make you a host?
Yeah, it's my part next, so if you can.
Okay, let me just make presenter. And you should now be a host.
Yeah, I think this should work. Okay, so now what do people see? Just the slides?
We see the slides and the pointer.
On the what, sorry?
And the pointer.
Okay, that's cool. That is what you need to be seeing. All right, so I'll, first of all, my name is Bence Farkas, and I'm an M2 student at the Cogmaster, majoring in cognitive neuroscience and in computational modeling. And in this short part, I will be talking about the role of computational models in cognitive science. So let's start by what models are. You can see a rudimentary definition, according to Wikipedia, of the act of scientific modeling. But briefly put, models allow you to, allow us to simplify complex systems in order to help us understand them. Now, given the obvious complexity of the brain and the mind and of behavior, it is not particularly surprising to see that modeling is very, very common in pretty much all branches of cognitive science. So the question of why exactly to model is a pretty diverse question, or rather with diverse answers. A influential early paper by, Rosenbluth and Wiener, who are two pioneers, so to speak, of cybernetics, has highlighted the role of understanding and control that models allow you to do. And in this more recent little paper by Cording and colleagues, they basically just did a short survey of computation modelers who work in the field of cognitive science to kind of rate the importance of all these different features of models in their own work. And you can see here that the usefulness of the model, its help in interpretation, its representational nature and all that were highlighted as being maybe the most important in modeling work, and its clinical relevance and microscopic accuracy maybe the least important. However, basically no feature can be really singled out to be that unimportant. Therefore, appreciating the diversity of modeling goals is really quite important, since in different applications, your model will need to be doing different things. So I thought we could go over quickly two types of classification schemes for how you might be able to classify models you come across during this lecture or just during your readings in cognitive science. This is an influential one by David Marr and Tommaso Poggio in their 1976 paper, which basically suggests that there are three complementary levels of analysis that you can model, and that if you have a model for all three of these levels, you will have a pretty decent understanding of what a particular system, the brain specifically, is doing. At the highest level, you have the computational level, which is all about describing what the system does and why it does particular things. At the algorithmic level, you describe how the system achieves these goals, how the system does what it does, and what representations does it use, and how does it manipulate them. And in the implementation level, you basically talk about how, or model, how the system is physically realized. For example, how neural networks might actually carry out the computation and algorithmic steps. However, for educational purposes, a more recent classification scheme by an equally influential book by Diane and Abbott, I think might be even better. So these three levels consist of an interpretive level, which would basically be the why level of modeling. This would roughly correspond to the computational level of the previous classification scheme. So at this level, you explain why the brain does something the way it does it. For example, one answer would be that because it is optimal to do so in some sense. One layer down at the mechanistic level, you try to give an answer as to how the brain does what it does. So this would be basically a mix of the implementational and the algorithmic levels of the previous classification scheme. So here you aim to show how neural circuits actually perform the complex function that you identified above. Finally, in the descriptive level, you're just looking for a kind of what answer. So you just aim to find a model that summarizes large amounts of data. So in order to give a kind of example of these different types of models, I thought we could go over how you might go about modeling reaction time data from a pretty simple perceptual judgment experiment. So let's imagine that you are interested in how people respond to visual stimuli, and you had a bunch of people come into the lab and perform a kind of visual detection task. So you just have a bunch of trials, and on each trial, you either present a visual stimulus or you don't, and people can respond with saying that there was a stimulus in that particular trial or that there wasn't. And you collected these reaction times, and a typical distribution of reaction times for the correct responses in blue and the incorrect responses in red will look like this. So at a first step, you just aim to find a model. So in this case, that would be a histogram or a probability distribution that kind of captures what are the most interesting aspects of this type of data. For example, you can already observe that these reaction times are not actually Gaussian, so they're not normally distributed. Rather, they have these long tail distributions, which means that there are much more extremely slow responses than extremely fast responses. And what might be a bit harder to discern in this figure, but is pretty typical, is that the wrong responses are overall just a tiny bit slower than the correct responses. Going a bit above to a mechanistic level, you might also be interested in what kind of mechanism would be able to generate this type of distributions. Well, you might consider this kind of perceptual judgment task as being kind of about accumulating evidence. So you can consider that as time goes on in a particular trial, people kind of observe the screen in front of them, and they have this kind of internal decision variable that they adjust from millisecond to millisecond. If they see a flicker of light, for example, that might push this little internal variable towards making the reaction, towards making the response that there is in fact a visual stimulus present. However, if they only see blackness, then that will push this decision variable towards the other option, namely that there is no stimulus present. And it turns out that this simple attenuation to threshold mechanism, so that after the decision variable reaches a particular threshold, you actually make the response. So this simple mechanism, called a drift diffusion model, or a DDM, is able to capture a lot of aspects of reaction time data, and also might have an interesting neurophysiological implementation in certain brain regions. Finally, you might also go one step further to the interpretive level. You might find out that, in fact, this particular type of model is actually optimal in some sense, which is true for the drift diffusion models, given that they are basically a continuous extension of a particular type of statistical test that actually does give you optimal solutions to these problems. Optimal in the sense of being the fastest for a given level of accuracy. Now, I'd like to basically conclude by highlighting two important broad class of models that kind of add something new to the simple agent and brain-oriented modeling frameworks that you might come across. So first of all, you can add in the environment to your modeling framework, which will basically give you something that is close to what we call reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning approaches at a very, very general level consider the brain and the human or animal that you are considering to be an agent which interacts with its environment. So it basically makes an action. The environment responds to that action by giving the agent a particular reward, so whether it's good or bad, what he did, and then moving on to the next state. After this, in the next state, the agent makes an action again, and it receives a reward again, and we go to the next state again. And this very general framework allows you to do a lot of interesting things. It's also very popular in computational neuroscience because, as it turns out, a particularly interesting computational quantity that is important in reinforcement learning, called the prediction error, might be in a very, very literal sense implemented in the brain. So this basically just means that one strategy that you can follow in these reinforcement learning scenarios is to compare your prediction for a particular outcome to the actual outcome and take the difference. And then this will basically give you a direction that you need to adjust your estimation to. And it turns out that certain neurons, known as dopaminergic neurons, which have dopamine as their neurotransmitter, actually do increase their firing rates where you have a positive prediction error, and decrease their firing rates when you have a negative prediction error. And finally, it is also pretty cool and very worthwhile to add time to your models and to consider the brain as a dynamical system. So these type of approaches kind of extend modeling by considering not only the state of your system, of the brain, of the mind at a particular time, rather to also explicitly consider information flow and the evolution of your system as time goes on. You can do this at multiple scales. For example, at the level of single neurons with these type of models, which are just based on a differential equations, which describe how one particular neuron might respond to the input it receives from other neurons. You can also kind of wire a couple of these neurons together to give you a particular temporal sequence of responses. You can also consider pools of neurons, which give you basically what the average response of like hundreds and hundreds of neurons would be. Or you can look at this at the level of the entire brain and give you this kind of graph theoretical brain networks, in which individual brain regions tend to be represented as nodes, with the connections between them being these little edges. And to give one recent, maybe interesting example of why it might be worthwhile to consider dynamics, there's this recent paper by Lupi and colleagues, which looked into the effects on brain connectivity of LSD. And what is important here is that they basically kind of divided at each time point the brain of the individuals into a predominantly integrated state, where which basically favors very global information processing, so that information from one particular area of the brain can reach the entire other end of the brain very easily, or a predominantly local segregated information processing, by which the brain really only kind of processes input in very localized little clusters. And what can be seen here is that the effects of LSD are located only in the segregated substates. So the take-home message here, other than do drugs, is to consider the importance of state dynamics in whatever experiment that you're trying to model. So this would be the end of my part. I'll stop sharing. And I'll try to make Avel presenter. If this works. Yeah, we can share we can see your screen, although I can't hear you if you're saying anything.
On t'entend pas. Ok, il faut que tu me mettes présentateur. I think he has some mic problem. I don't know. So I guess he's going to make the presentation with my computer. I don't know. Sorry.
Whatever works.
Allô, vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Yes.
Ok. Et vous voyez l'écran ou pas? Qu'est-ce qu'on fait
Yeah,
pour
we
suivre
can
l'écran?
see you and we
Ouais.
can see the presentation.
Bah, c'est ça l'écran qui est capturé, non? C'était ça. Pourquoi t'as fait ça?
Mais tu m'as passé le truc, je n'ai touché à rien.
Ah, 2 secondes. Alors, écran, onglet, partager. Voilà, maintenant tu fais tout à partir de là.
Okay, so now you can wait. Iona, pourquoi c'est pas la présentation que d'aujourd'hui?
Tu me fatigues. Mais c'est complètement la présentation d'aujourd'hui par contre. Hein.
C'est écrit en français. C'est celle du semestre dernier.
Oui. Est-ce que
On
tu
fait pas la présentation du semestre
Je
dernier.
sais, 2 secondes. 2 secondes. Partager. Voilà. C'est bon.
Hello. Hello. Can someone hear me?
Ouais.
Okay, you can see the screen, I guess.
Yep.
And this is now the correct presentation. I think we're good to go. So, given I asked whether people preferred to be late or to be too lack as a kill my parts and one word, I guess I can extend over schedule, which is anyway necessary since we're over schedule. So I'm called Avel, alias Serval. I did the co-master 4 years ago with an accent of computational neuroscience and behavioral science. And now I'm working in epistemology of evolution and cognition, essentially. And I represent the end of the session on the relation between cognition and society, and on the myth and the myth of cognitive science. So the main goal of cognitive science is to naturalize the science of man, of the human mind. Question that is, since its existence, is whether we can use it to either understand societies or to act on societies. So there is a number of research programs and disciplines that are at the interface of social sciences and of cognitive sciences. Essentially, you have these 5 things. It's a Roth classification. Something you can see is that there is a confusion, I'll say, between cognitive science, behavioral science, and evolutionary science, because all are integrated in the study of societies. When we study societies, we're interested mostly by how people act within the context of society, and there is no clear division between cognitive science, evolutionary science, and behavioral science for this purpose. So I'll try to introduce this deeper by presenting 3 core notions. The first is the notion of ecological cognition. One way to integrate cognitive science and social sciences is to study how people do cognition outside the lab. So there is at least 2 things you can do. The first, which is the line of work of Guillaume Dumas, is to basically put small societies in the lab and to measure not how people respond to stimuli, but how people like spontaneously interact, and what it means in terms of brain, neural, and behavioral synchronization. Another thing you can do, which is associated to the extended cognition program, is to interest oneself into what are cultural modulation of cognition. So one example, which is very much famous due to Clark's introduction, is the example of the notebook. When you think, when you try to memorize things, you will use phones, notebooks, pens, whatever. And this will therefore modulate how you think and interact with the world. You can also study how specific cognitive gadgets, that is, culturally evolved technology for thinking, have emerged historically, for example, with the evolution of mathematics, which did not exist basically before some Greek people decided they would formalize intuitive thinking. And you have a widely instituted program in the social science, which is called ethnomethodology, which is basically talking to people and trying to synthesize what concept they use and how they relate. And this is another approach to ecological cognition. Another line of study, which is more, way more known, is the study of behavioral or cognitive bias. So the main foundation of this is Kahneman's work in behavioral economy, which is very much in line with cognitive science research because it will present people with problems, typically economic problems, and try to measure what are their decisions and more specifically how they deviate from standard economic modeling. In economy, we think that people are rational and try to maximize profits. Behavioral economy shows that in a lot of ways, people make apparently suboptimal use of information. For example, they value loss more than they value gain. So if you have you'd prefer, it is as bad to risk losing €2 than to risk gaining 1. This is there is a polarity issue, but I think you get the point. And this is used in policy, in public policy, by using known biases to try to influence people, hopefully for the public good. This is also Kahneman work, so I did not provide citations. Sorry. Sorry for the mis-slide change. So one way you can influence behavior is to change, for example, the default choice in insurance policy. So you have to file a paper, and more people will get an insurance if this is the first choice they're presented to. So this is a rather ethical way to do nudges. These are called nudges because it's transparent. You leave the decision to people, and you are only changing the framing so that the mean behavior is, on average, better, the better possible for the average individual. Another type of nudge is still benevolent, but is, how to say, below the attention line. So for example, you will put apple first in a canteen rack so that people do not think of trash food and eat the apples. And a third way it can be used is not benevolent. It is publicity. It is getting other people to do what you need them to do. Most people agree it's not ethically optimal. Another line of study, which is very instituted in the cognitive science of society, is the integration of evolution, cognition, and the social sciences. So there is a rather wide agreement, I'd say universal agreement, that human psychology and behavior is evolved. And a lot of anthropology, psychologists, historians, etc., in different way integrate evolution theory and methods from cognitive science in their work. The lead of that school are mainly Muthu Krishna and Heinrich, so I provided a citation from them. There is another way of integrated cognition and evolution and social sciences, which is more hardcore, which is to consider that significant extent of human cognition is a mechanism that each have evolved specifically to solve a specific adaptive challenge. And this is very interesting for cognitive scientists because if mechanisms have a specific purpose, then you can make them express equivalently in the wild and in the lab. So if this is true, it is very straightforward to make experiments that will show how humans behave in the wild. So that's called evolutionary psychology. We will talk about cognition and society in 2 different sessions, which are the 2 last ones. Maybe some of you have attended to the last semester courses where there were more of them. So both are complementary, so it's good for those of you who did attend. And something that I will do now is to show limitations of cognitive science and ways in which either cognitive scientists or public discourse fail to acknowledge this limitation and get into, well, neuromyth. Maybe some of you know Idris Aberkan. You should know Idris Aberkan. So first, before I get into the myth, I will state 3 things that are rather general about how cognitive science work. The first is that, as was stated earlier, cognitive science differ from behaviorism, I forgot the word, in one significant way, which is that cognitive science is not agnostic regarding the content of mind. And what we have discovered, or at least precised since the emergence of cognitive science, is that specific brain parts will interact with other brain parts and population within these brain parts to implement specific dynamics. And these dynamics work to make cognition happen. The image you see is a simple representation of how learning and decision-making work. So I will not walk you through the math, it's not useful. What is important is that every of the blue parts and their interaction will implement dynamical system equation that describe how humans, animals, things like this learn. And what is explanatory is the description of specific mechanism and how they work, what function they fulfill within the mind. The thing is, this mechanism, they are not isolated. They are embedded in a complex, very complex biological, psychological, social, whatever context. And the processes in which they work are fulfill a property that is known as autonomy, which means that they are basically self-maintaining, which also means that the structure of mechanism is not the sole determinant of behavior. And you have, if you want to understand what a mechanism does, to understand in what biological, evolutionary, developmental, social, cultural context it does. And yet, most of cognitive science work by stimulus-response paradigm. So you show someone something, you see what brain parts lighten up or what they do. And to get a good grasp on what autonomous dynamics happen within someone, with this approach is hard, extremely hard, because brains react in unpredictable ways, which I guess is kind of obvious, but needs to be told. So these 3 things together give rise to a lot of phantasm, I don't know, about what cognitive science may do. And I will debunk, I will at least throw doubt at 3 programs that are very influential and in cognitive science. The first is the idea that if you map the brain precisely enough, you will be able to predict or understand cognition. This is not true for 2 reasons. The first is that, as Bence said, the role of model is to simplify. If you have an extensive model of everything there is, congratulations, you have the world. This existence of the world does not help you understand. So you need simplificatory models. And the second problem is that each brain has ecological, developmental, evolutionary dynamics that determine its behavior and its, well, development, how it's structured physically. So having the map of isolated brain will not help you understanding how its cognitive function has developed, at least not on its own. Second limit there is to cognitive science is the ability to reduce cognition to a set of formal, tractable, algorithmic rules. The language in which the brain behaves is the language of dynamical systems. You have parts that interact. We have a good grasp on the math of that, and it is not similar to the math of algorithm. So the initial cognitive science project, which is to say what are the rules that people apply in thinking, is not possible, at least in a consistent way with the knowledge we have in neuroscience and ecological cognition. And the third limit we have is, and I'm sorry for attacking the form of cognitive science, which is very good, but this is the one illustration I found, is the idea that understanding the brain will bring understanding of societies. As I said before, there are autonomous social and cultural processes, and it's very useful to understand how humans think to get how they think in the wild. That's kind of obvious to say. But it's not enough to understand how the brain is made to understand what people will think, what are the structurants of society as a, well, structural scale. And you need to account for specific models of social cultural behavior to integrate the study of cognition in society. And that's why that's what we'll talk about at the end of the session. So session 12 on the can cognitive mechanism explain society. So here we go. I think it's a nice slide. Yes, it is. So I'm sorry we went over schedule. I'm sorry some of you had to disconnect before it was ended. So I think now we may pass to questions if there are any. No, everyone is sleeping.
Yeah. I think, as Louis said, we won't have a really precise question before doing the whole presentation, so it's okay.
Sorry?
We won't have any question until we do the whole presentations.
Okay, so I guess that everyone that is attending, I'm not an organizer, is satisfied with the introduction. What do we do, Louis? Do we cut it?
Yeah. I think we can end it here. Thank you for everyone who stayed, and we'll keep you posted for the next course, which will be then next week, next Wednesday, which will be a course by Iona on the history of concepts in cognitive science. Okay, well, I'll let everyone go then.
Bye. See you all. We'll meet again in 4 months. Remember, fodder is very bad. You need to stay away from fodder. Thank you for listening.
Bye.
This